What's up? DisThunder here. Today we're going to take a look at the SSR Concepts Knight of Vengeance 1/12 scale figure, which, if you don't speak third party, is Flashpoint Batman, Thomas Wayne, Bat Dad, or Bat Daddy if you're weird. Gonna try to keep it short and sweet. It's a fun figure, it's got some issues, so we'll get into it. First up, I wanted to bring attention to the aesthetic of this figure. This particular costume is based on an Arkham Knight skin for Flashpoint Batman, as opposed to a particular comic or animated representation. And in that regard, emulating the game skin, I think this figure is very successful. To give you an idea of how this figure fits 1/12 scale style, you see he is a bit on the larger side. He is using the Mix-Max body that we saw recently with the Deathstroke third-party figure, so I'll bring that in as well. But that does give him a good height and a good thickness. He does have big man syndrome with his arms, not as bad as Deathstroke's, but you can still see where he's jutting out in that kind of A pose. But as far as like the head proportions and things like that, I think he is pretty good. The hands may be a touch small, but overall I think it works well design language-wise. So we're almost 11 years to the day Flashpoint Batman made his first appearance in DC Comics back in 2011. And I do find it interesting that while there's been quite a few figures and a lot of third-party stuff, we haven't yet seen an official Mezco, and it feels like it's right up their alley. I want to bring the unmasked head in for comparison real quick. I'll show it in greater detail in the next frame, but this just gives you an idea of the overall size and scale. They are pretty comparable. One of the things I run into with third-party figures is the heads feel undersized, especially compared to a Mezco, but I feel like this is pretty close. Let's move flashback and we can talk about accessories. So 2 heads, optional hands, 2 pistols, and a sword. This is based, I think, on the book. It's the Atlantean sword that he uses toward the end. As you can see, the pommel comes off, so it's easier to fit into the hand. And actually, this feels like a pretty good quality piece. It's not flimsy or rubbery, and it's got some nice sculpting details in there and some good paint work. So these 2 pistols, there's not really a real-world equivalent that I can think of that matches up to these, but they do match the Prime 1 Studios Flashpoint Batman statue really well, which is obviously where a lot of this figure's inspiration comes from. They don't feature removable magazines or anything, but they are nicely sculpted and nicely painted. And I have to say, I think these are 2 of the best thigh holsters I've seen on a 6-inch figure. They hold impressively well. As you would expect for those hand options, you have 2 pistol holding hands and 2 sword holding hands, as well as 2 fists and a gesturing open splayed hand. They're not really an accessory, but he does have removable shoulder pauldrons, and they're held on with Velcro, which is an interesting choice. I would say actually a terrible idea, but it works not too bad in practice. You just have to be extra cautious of the cape because, as you can imagine, it could catch in there and then you got snags, and that's no good. And that'd be a shame because the cape itself is actually a very nice material. I mentioned that this uses the Mix-Max large body like Deathstroke does, or third-party Deathstroke. And I actually think that this Batman gets better use out of it than Deathstroke does because obviously he has less armor to contend with. I actually think the body has a decent silhouette and all the right points of articulation are there. I just don't think they stack up as well to, say, a Mezco or a V-Toys of similar size. That's more of an opinion thing, though. There's nothing specifically wrong or mechanically wrong with the figure, so your mileage may absolutely vary in that regard. Another thing these figures have in common, I think, is strength in costuming. Both the suits have a lot of great detail and texture work to them, so let's go over some of that in a little more detail. As I mentioned, I like both head sculpts quite a bit, and I like the overall suit texture. The vinyl symbol is an interesting tactile feel, but it works well. Hard plastic for the abdominal armor, and then the belts are a flexible, kind of rubbery plastic. The knee pads are actually on nylon straps. They're kind of small, but they are movable and also removable if you don't like them. And lastly, the boot sculpt is actually pretty good on its own, but that's kind of where our troubles start. Like I said, overall articulation is actually better than Deathstroke, despite being the same body, because the costume works with it more, like with the abdominal joint and the shoulder joints. But when we get into the elbows here, you'll notice that that forearm guard is actually a sleeve, and as a result, it slides up and can push the hands off because they have ridiculous little flesh-colored wrist pegs in there. Initially, I thought the hands might be a little too soft, and they might be, but I think that problem's compounded by those terrible wrist joints. Lower body functional range is actually not too shabby. The holsters and belt work pretty well with the thigh cuts and the hip range, so there's really no trouble there. You have double jointed knees with an adequate range of motion in them. That's not too bad. It's the boots that are the problem. They are a solid piece with a slight swivel. There's no pivot whatsoever, and as you can see from the way the pants are bunched up, they're not even all that well fitted to the figure. And lastly, for the neck, the collar piece is one solid piece, but the head is on a barbell joint that sits into the neck, which allows for a pretty decent range of motion. No trouble there. Here's that unmasked head sculpt on the body again in a little bit greater detail. He does share another minor issue that Deathstroke had, which is that head likes to take the neck peg with it when you swap heads. It's not a huge deal, but I want to bring it up. Likewise, I mentioned the hands being a little soft. The big problem seems to be these gun-holding hands, where these pinky fingers don't want to wrap around the mag well, and they don't hold the guns overly securely. I think the problem is really these two hands, because the others don't seem as bad, but these are very soft, and it seems like every time I try to fit them to better hold the pistols, I end up pulling them off those little puny wrist pegs again. As much as I love McFarlane Toys, very few figures I get from them stay factory, so unfortunately I can't give you a proper comparison between the two figures. However, this side-by-side gives you a good idea of the relative head size and similarity, and for what it's worth, I actually really like that McFarlane head sculpt as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't bring in the Drone Customs kit on the Sovereign Knight body, which is still a great looking figure. And even if this SSR figure was perfect, there would still be a place in my collection for both these figures. They both represent two very distinct takes on the Thomas Wayne Batman. Okay, now we're to the hard part where I've got to try to boil this down and give you a recommendation if one is warranted. On the pro side, I think he has a very good scale, unlike some of the third-party figures that feel kind of underscale with something like 112. The base body feels pretty quality. I don't feel like any joints want to pop off like shoulders or hips or anything like that. The head sculpt, the suits, the accessories like the belt and the holsters and the gauntlets, they're all very nicely realized and feel pretty quality as well. And other than the boots, which I feel like unarticulated boots on a style figure like this is kind of unforgivable. The little stuff like the wrist pegs and the squishy hands and the neck peg thing, those are minor. And honestly, they feel more like oversights than outright design flaws, if that makes sense. Still, we're talking about a figure that'll run you $100 or more, so it's important to take those into account if it's something you want to do. So I would say I recommend with caution. As for me, I may be doing some custom work on mine. If you decide to go for it, I got mine at VC Toy Box. They've always taken great care of me. I think that's going to do it. Hopefully this was a little bit informative or entertaining, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care till then.